For 10 years, as your pastor, I avoided preaching a sermon series on giving. And I don't know why I ever did that, because this has been one of my favorite series to preach. Maybe the reason for that is it cuts to the core of my own heart. And I hope it cuts to the core of your heart, because as we looked at last week, where your treasure is, or a couple weeks ago, there your heart will be also. There was a young man named Michael Gaduri, and I'm not sure I'm pronouncing his name right, but he lived, I think, in Quebec in Canada. And he was some of you may have read this news story this week. He was fascinated by the Mayan civilization in Central America. And this young man was 15 years old, and he came up with the theory that he was noticing that many of the Mayan cities were located in places that made no sense for a city. Meaning, typically in ancient times, you'd put a city by a waterway, or you'd have a source of water, or you'd have some huge resource available, or something like that. But the Mayan cities, for whatever reason, just seemed, at least on the surface, to be random and not placed in what you would think of as convenient places. So did any of you see this news story? Yeah, you did. Okay. So he came up with this theory at 15 years old. You know our youth today, they're not producing anything, not doing anything. No, I'm kidding. He thought, the Mayans were fascinated by the stars, and they referred to constellations in a lot of their writings and a lot of what they tried to figure out, times and, astrology kind of stuff. So he thought to himself, he said, what if I were to compare the constellations that the Mayans were aware of and locate cities based on the locations of the main stars in those constellations? And so he started identifying, literally, I think he identified over 150 cities that matched up with the main stars, the primary stars in the constellations that the Mayans were fascinated with. And then he took it one step further, and he thought to himself, well, if they did this, then maybe we could discover some lost Mayan cities by looking at the constellations they were fascinated with, and if there was a missing city in reference point to the cities that already existed, then maybe we could find it. And so he took satellite imagery from the Canadian Space Agency. I didn't even know there was a Canadian Space Agency, and then he put it together with Google Earth, and sure enough, he located in the middle of the jungle these structures. You could see like these square structures underneath the jungle overgrowth, and other scientists said, why did we never think of this? And so he's found at least one and maybe more cities that were lost in the jungle just by simply predicting where they would be based on the stars or the constellations that the Mayans looked at. When I saw that story, you're going to have to track with me here, I thought, Jesus prayed in the Lord's Prayer as we've come to know it. Jesus prayed, "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come, thy will be done." And then what did he say? On earth as it is in heaven. Does anyone know where that sound is coming from? The fan. Oh, okay. We'll survive. This is going to be a short sermon anyway, so. Is anyone really hot? Okay. I don't want to take off my suit jacket because there were a few wrinkles that I failed to get out of my shirt, so I'll just sweat it out up here. No. I was thinking of the Lord's Prayer. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then I thought of what Paul said in Colossians 3, set your mind on things above, not on things on earth, for your life is hidden with Christ in God. And I thought to myself, we base our lives sometimes on the wrong things, if you will. That we're looking at earthly things to make our decisions, when instead we should be, if I can make this leap, heavenly things, or we should set our minds on the things above to make decisions about what's going on earth. And in fact, if what Jesus prayed is possible, which he wouldn't have prayed it if it wasn't, that we are supposed to be agents in some way of helping God's kingdom come on earth, or become a reality on earth as it is in heaven. And then you're seeing how my mind works. Then I thought, how does that relate to giving? And now I'm making another transition here. I thought to myself about the heavenly reality that changes the earthly reality. So the heavenly truth or reality that changes what's going on earth, and more specifically changes what's going on in our hearts. I'm going to come back to that in just a second. Now I'm going to backtrack. We started this series looking at Cain and Abel, and we found that God is a God who wants sincere, wholehearted worship. He wanted the first fruits of what they had to offer, and he was willing to give Cain a second chance. But sin had taken such a deep root in Cain's heart, one generation from the first sinner, that in Genesis 3, the serpent had to talk Eve into sinning, and in Genesis 4, God himself could not talk Cain out of sinning. And Cain, who had a second chance to find his reward in God himself, whose face was downcast, and God said, will your face not be lifted up if you do what is right? And lifted up to do what? To see me, right? And so we saw that God is interested in the worship of his people, and that the worship of his people is tied to where their hearts are. Then we jumped ahead to Abraham, who was asked to give his one and only son. You remember that story? And Abraham getting up early in the morning and going with his son, and Isaac saying, Father, I see the wood and I see the fire, but where's the lamb? And he says, God will provide for himself a lamb. And he told the young men who were with them, Isaac and I are going over there to worship, and we will return to you. And he was speaking with great faith. And we said with that, the God who gives us everything, God was the one who gave Isaac to Abraham. The God who gives us everything can require anything. The God who gives us everything can require anything, but he's also the God who meets our deepest needs in his one and only Son. Then we leapt ahead. What did we preach on? Sometimes people quote sermons to me, and I think, I said that? So that's really good. You ought to write that down. I don't know what I said. But 2 weeks ago, when Rachel Walker was here with us, I preached on this idea that I mentioned earlier, that Jesus says, and I have it, I think, up here, verse 21 in Matthew 6, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. And we talked about this idea of follow the money, that if you want to find out where your heart is, follow your treasure. Find out where you're putting your treasure. And then, if I can put it another way, I remember the sermon that I forgot in there, but I'll come back to it. If I can put it another way, if you want to change where your heart is, change where you're putting your treasure. Because your heart will follow your treasure. Jesus doesn't say for where your heart is, that's where you'll give your treasure, in verse 21. He says, for where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. So what comes first is where you're putting your treasure. Which reminds me of the previous sermon that I forgot. You are what you love. Do you remember that? And this sermon is simply an extension of you are what you love, that the habits of your heart determine what is holy to you. The habits of your heart determine what is holy to you. Wherever your treasure is, that's where you'll find your heart. Follow the money. So back to the question that started this sermon. What heavenly reality changes our earthly reality? How can your will be done on earth as it is in heaven? How can we set our minds on things above and not on things on earth? What is the link, if you will, between heaven and earth that can affect our hearts in worship? And here's what I came up with, and this is a bit of a leap, but stay with me. We are made, as creatures of God, we are made to worship. We are creatures that we seek glory somewhere. We are made to be worshipers. We have, you've heard it said before, a God-sized hole in us that can only be filled with God. But I think maybe it'd be better to say we have an awe hole in us. Something that's longing to be filled with awe and wonder. And we're drawn to those things. We're made to be worshipers. I remember, and I'm skipping past a passage, but I'll come back to it. I remember when we went to Yosemite, when Ben, I think, was, I don't know how old he was, just 2 or something like that, which that was an adventure, climbing on 3,000-foot cliffs, and Benjamin saying, "Dad, look at me!" Whoa! Be ready, Ben. It's coming for you. You've seen this picture before. When we got to Yosemite, and you drive up around, and you're like, okay, we're going to stop at this lookoff, and then you see it yourself. You're like, wow, that really is as beautiful as they said it was going to be. And that trip to Yosemite, we took a recommendation in a guidebook. You know how there are guidebooks. And they said, go up to, I think it's called Glacier Point, but I'm not sure of that, where you can look down on the valley and look across a half dome. Am I right on that, Miles? Miles has probably been out there a lot more than most of us. And we took this picture, and what you can't see in the picture is that the full moon is rising behind Half Dome a little bit off to the right there. And the color isn't quite as good on that one as back there, but in any case, we're standing there and I'm thinking, this is amazing. How am I standing here, of all places on earth, to watch this sunset and moonrise, full moonrise, and I was filled with awe and wonder. And there were all kinds of people there also watching the same thing, filled with awe and wonder. And I didn't see one of them that were kind of like, yeah, whatever. Seen that a million times. No big deal. Right? They were made to be worshipers. And we were seeing something that had a certain kind of glory to it. And we were drawn to it. And we were stunned by the beauty of it. Some of you know the name of John Muir. Have you ever heard the name John Muir? John Muir was born in the, I don't remember when, 1830s. And he died in 1914, I think, of pneumonia or something. But John Muir was the ultimate naturalist. And he would hike all over the Sierra Nevada. And he would journal about it. And he would camp out overnight. And he was just devoted to this part of the country. And he was one of the ones, I think Yellowstone was our first national park. Some of you can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But he was the one who lobbied and lobbied and lobbied to get Yosemite made into a national park. And at first, when it was first made into a park, it was under state control. And then he lobbied and lobbied Roosevelt, President Teddy Roosevelt, and I think I have a picture there of them standing in Yosemite to get him to make this a national park. And so the law was put in place that kind of instituted our whole national park system whereas before it was just Yellowstone and then Yosemite. I read a little anecdote about this. This has nothing to do with the sermon, I'm sorry. But Roosevelt said to John Muir, he said, I want to really experience this Sierra Nevada. Help me do that. And so he said, well, go camping with me. So John Muir and Teddy Roosevelt, the President of the United States, just hiked off in the wilderness together to go camping. And they camped overnight somewhere, and it was frost in the morning and all this, and I thought, I don't think that would happen nowadays. The president would just wander off in the wilderness with some guy taking him camping. Anyway, the reason I brought up John Muir, you're all wondering, is I want you to listen to, this was guidebooks before there were cars and planes. No, there were cars. Were there cars in 1914? Maybe just barely. And he wrote this about, if you have one day to spend in Yosemite, this is what you should do. And the reason I'm reading this to you is I want you to sense the awe that he has for this place and the spiritual words he uses, the words like glory, to describe it. And then the other thing I want you to kind of capture, by the way, John Muir was raised in as I understand it, a devoutly Christian home. He had memorized 3/4 of the Old Testament and all of the New Testament. I don't know if you knew that. And so you hear biblical kinds of language coming through in what he writes. So this is his journal, and this is his recommendation. I laughed when I read this because I thought, if you were in good enough shape to do this, that would be saying something. Here's what you should do if you only have one day to spend in Yosemite. He says, if I were so time poor as to have only one day to spend in Yosemite, I should start at daybreak, say at 3 o'clock in the morning, with a pocket full of any sort of dry breakfast stuff for Glacier Point, Sentinel Dome, the head of Illilouette Fall, Nevada Fall, the top of Liberty Cap, Vernal Fall, and the wild boulder-choked River Canyon. All those places are where he wants you to go in one day by hiking. The trail leaves the valley at the base of the Sentinel Rock, and as you slowly saunter, I'm thinking, yeah, that's quite a saunter. As you slowly saunter from point to point along its many accommodating zigzags, nearly all the valley rocks and falls are seen in striking, ever-changing combinations. At an elevation of about 500 feet, a particularly fine, wide-sweeping view down the valley is obtained, past the sheer face of the Sentinel and between the Cathedral Rocks and El Capitan. At a height of about 1,500 feet, the great half dome comes full in sight, overshadowing every other feature of the valley to the eastward. From Glacier Point, you look down 3,000 feet over the edge of its sheer face to the meadows and groves and innumerable yellow pine spires, with the meandering river sparkling and spangling through the midst of them. Across the valley, a great telling view is presented by the Royal Arches, North Dome, Indian Canyon, Three Brothers, and El Capitan, with the dome-paved basin of Yosemite Creek and Mount Hoffman in the background. To the eastward, the half-dome close beside you, looking higher and more wonderful than ever. Southeastward, the Star King girdled with silver firs, and the spacious garden-like basin of the Illilouette and its deeply sculptured fountain peaks called the Merced Group. And beyond all, marshaled along the eastern horizon, the icy summits on the axis of the range and broad swaths of forests growing on ancient moraines, while the Nevada, Vernal, and Yosemite Falls are not only full in sight, but are distinctly heard as if one were standing beside them in their spray. I'm going to skip just a bit. From Glacier Point, go down the trail into the lower end of the Illilouette Basin, cross Illilouette Creek, and follow it to the fall, where from an out-jutting rock at its head, you will get a fine view of its rejoicing waters and wild canyon and the Half Dome. Then returning to the trail, follow it to the head of the Nevada Fall. Linger here for an hour or two, for not only have you glorious views of the wonderful fall, but of its wild, leaping, exulting rapids, and greater than all, the stupendous scenery into the heart of which the white, passionate river goes wildly thundering, surpassing everything of its kind in the world. After an unmeasured hour or so of this glory, all your body aglow, nerve currents flashing through you never felt before. Go to the top of Liberty Cap, only a glad saunter now that your legs as well as head and heart are awake and rejoicing with everything. That's worship, isn't it? In Romans chapter 1, Paul says these disheartening words. I'm not going to read all of it, but beginning in verse 22, Paul says that people claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and reptiles. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. And that's not what I want to focus on. I want to focus on that next phrase. Because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Watch what you worship, because we become what we worship. Watch what you worship, because we become what we worship. You are what you love. The habits of your heart will determine what is holy to you. But here's the thing. The glory of God has a transforming power to it. In fact, in 2 Corinthians 3, which we read earlier, you see the last verse there. It says, we all with unveiled face, verse 18, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image. That means the image of the glory of the Lord. From one degree of glory to another, for this comes from the Lord who is the Spirit. John 1, which we looked at in Sunday school, says, we beheld His glory, the glory of the one and only Son of the Father, full of grace and truth. So watch what you worship, because we become what we worship. And glory has the power to transform you. Have you ever met someone who worshiped stuff and they became their stuff? Have you ever seen that? I don't mean, I don't want to be too hard here, but I keep too much junk around my house. In fact, when we moved to Kansas over 10 years ago, we put a whole bunch of stuff in our basement, and 98% of it we haven't touched in 10 years. I keep too much stuff. But Michelle, as she travels around to different homes to do health care, she sees people who you can barely get through their homes because there's so much stuff. There's just little corridors between all the stacked stuff. And they have become defined by their stuff because they worship stuff. Watch what you worship. Make sure that what you worship is worthy of worship, worthy of your worship. Glory has the power to transform. The people that Paul was writing to in Rome, he was writing about those who had become subject to the wrath of God, and they exchanged the glory of God for images made to look like people and animals and creatures. So today's message is just a warning and also an encouragement. Watch what you worship. Make sure it's worthy of your worship, because we become what we worship. Also, your great hope is that if you worship Jesus, His glory has a transforming power in your life, so that you become more and more and more like Him, from one degree of glory to another, it says. If you worship the right person, then the fact that you become what you worship is the best news in the whole world. Do you see that? If you worship the right thing, which in this case is the only thing, the only one, if you worship Jesus Christ, then you will become like him. I don't mean that you will be Jesus. I mean that you will slowly but surely begin to reflect his glory more and more. You know, one of the problems with Michael Gaduri, who found these Mayan cities, was that they couldn't really see the cities except the faint outline of them because of the jungle overgrowth. And they talked about the fact that they would need to go there and verify that there were actually Mayan cities there, but they said, we think because we see some squares and some other things that there actually are cities there, we just have to get there to see beneath the jungle overgrowth to verify it. I don't know if this makes sense, but sometimes I think our hearts get cluttered and overgrown. And there's all kinds of stuff that prevent us from worshiping what is worthy, or from worshiping Jesus. And so the transforming power of his glory, if you will, is reduced for us because our hearts, which were meant to be glory reflectors, have somehow become glory deflectors. Watch what you worship because you become what you worship. Make sure what you worship is worthy. And if you think, you know, I do worship Jesus, but it doesn't seem like the glory of who he is, the beauty of who he is, it doesn't seem like it's transforming your heart, then ask yourself, you know, is there too much overgrowth there, maybe undergrowth, I don't know what the word is, that I can't be a glory reflector as God intended me to be? I want to call the worship team forward, and we're just going to sing this chorus with you. And as you do, examine your heart. Do you have a heart to worship the only thing in the whole universe that's really worthy of being worshiped? Jesus Christ himself. God the Father, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I want to sing this song. If you're able, stand with us and we'll sing as we close our service today. Jesus, you are worthy. Worthy is the Lamb who was slain. By the power of the Spirit in us, Jesus, I pray that you would transform us from one degree of glory to the next into your image. Lord, make us true reflectors of your glory, we pray. Amen. May the Lord bless you today.